And this has a lot to do with the success of the anti-colonial movements in the 50s and the 60s, the Algerian Revolution, for example, the rise of radical cultural politics on race, gender, environment, class, the ability of the Palestinian national movement to impose itself, the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole legal representative of the Palestinian people, that was a revolution in itself. And massive acts of resistance, really, culminating in what Rashid Khalidi considers to be the only successful Palestinian moment, which is the First Intifada. And that really created a tremendous interest among scholars in actual Palestinians, as opposed to Palestine, or as opposed to the Holy Land. And they relied a lot on locally generated sources, oral history, court records, whether church records, Islamic court records, the built environment, civil institutions of various kinds, material culture, crafts, textiles, folk practices, diaries, letters, works of art, music, fiction, etc. These became the things that people turned to in order to understand Palestine and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And in so doing, for the first time, they shed some light on really marginalized spaces. There are certain parts of Palestine that don't get historians at all, hardly. Hebron, for example, or Gaza, they have very few historians compared to histories of Jerusalem, etc. Groups, merchants, peasants, women, etc., became of interests, and periods that had not been studied. When I first started my own work in the 80s, there was not a single book on Palestine in the 17th century. And there was only one on the 18th. And now this period is of great interest for historians, because they see in it as the key formative moment for Palestinian society of the 20th century. The families, the property regime, the social structure, etc., really formed during that period. You cannot understand the 20th century without understanding the 17th and 18th centuries, for example. And now it's too early to judge, I think, where we're going in the post-Oslo, post-Cold War period in terms of historical writings on Palestine. But two trends are worthy of note. I have 1 minute left, I know. On Anglophile histories on Palestine and Arab-Israeli conflict. First is the resurfacing of civilization and religion as key units of analysis, especially following the failure of the Arab nationalist project, the signing of a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, both of which were discussed today, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, I might add, and of course 9/11. The second is that scholars are turning their gaze eastward. The current generation of scholars is really growing up under the shadow of massive US military involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are absorbing a political vocabulary based on a Sunni-Shia divide as a framing device for understanding the world. And they take for granted that the US-Iran confrontation is the primary regional dynamic. Meanwhile, the Palestinian national movement seems to be moribund, the Israeli colonization project is in high gear, and globalization is undermining the centrality of the state as a focus of intellectual inquiry. Now, so where does this leave the once luminous topic of Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict? That remains to be seen. What is clear is that the modes or the formats of knowledge production, books, universities, professors, libraries, are losing their privileged place. As the think tanks, the internet, are replacing the university and library in many ways. And this is especially true when it comes to historical writings on Palestine, because most academics who actually take the time to study the conflict in detail and the history in detail, regardless of whether they're Israeli, Palestinian, or American, or English, or so on, actually agree on all the major facts because they're inescapable. And so that has pushed, in many ways, those who absolutely understand the significance of controlling or shaping the narrative about what Palestine is and who the Palestinians are, it pushed them to really abandon the universities and abandon the monograph and abandon deep research and invest their monies and their time in blogs and internet sites and think tanks, and so they can spin that conflict, control its representation after they had really lost the academic ground for doing so. And we see this happening in a very big way in the United States especially. So the fundamental challenge, and I will end here, is not so much the lack of sufficient sources or facts or research, but the power of framing the conflict. How did they control or shape the narratives? How can Palestinians do that? Especially at a moment when this discursive erasure, the erasure by the book, that has been going on for 200 years, really, is now been given almost material form by the Zionist colonial project, which pushed it to extremes. Palestinians are losing the two deepest and greatest reservoirs or treasures for understanding their narrative. And these are the landscape itself. If you take satellite photos of what's happened in the last 50 years in Palestine, the land has been completely reshaped in a way that hasn't for 2,000 years. And it's very difficult to understand what it was like before. And as we know from our ethnographic studies of the 18th and 19th and early 20th century, Palestinian living memory is very much tied and influenced by relationship to material spaces, the trees, the orchard, the grove, the house, etc. And the second thing that they are losing is the society itself. The fragmentation that we see taking place among the Palestinians, inability to see each other, to even visit each other, the ability to, the bonds that create something we call a national memory are being systematically and bureaucratically pulled apart by a whole range of jurisdiction. Major challenge for Palestinians on how to reunite their body politic in that respect. Thank you.
I think Bishara Domani was too modest to indicate that his book triggered all these recent studies, but I highly advise you to look at his history of Jebel Nablus, which is available outside, published by the Institute for Palestine Studies, which was an important study, a breakthrough in understanding the social transformation in the late Ottoman period in central Palestine. Our next speaker is Professor Rashid Khalidi, and he will talk on the treatment of the Palestinian question in Anglo-American works since 1948. Rashid is Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, and his recent publications include Sowing Crisis, American Dominance, and the Cold War in the Middle East. A very important work, The Iron Cage, the story of the Palestinian struggle for statehood, is now available in Arabic. That's right. And a very important work, earlier work, 1996, Palestinian Identity, the Construction of Modern National Consciousness. In addition, Rashid is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Palestine Studies.
I agree with Bishara. There are many internal forces, but of the external forces, Britain and the United States were the most important ones. And this has been true at least since the time of the Balfour Declaration, and it remains true at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Many factors played a part in cementing the support for Zionism of its two primary international sponsors, in winning over the British and American political classes and their respective publics to the cause of Zionism and Israel. Both scholarly and non-academic writings in English played a crucial role. Indeed, I would argue that the hegemony of Zionism in the field of ideas and in Anglo-American academic and public discourse was a vital precondition for its successes in the political and diplomatic arenas. Now, the Zionist narrative was already dominant in the United Kingdom and in the United States before 1948, when my story begins. It became even more firmly entrenched in the 6 decades since then, through writings in history, politics, journalism, and literature. I can't cover all of this production in a short paper like this. In fact, I think there may be more writings on Zionism in Israel in English than in any other language, with the possible exception of Hebrew. The reason for this is not hard to understand. Zionist leaders always understood perfectly where to focus their efforts to gain the external support that was vital in their effort to turn an Arab country into a Jewish state and to create an impregnable position for it in a hostile region. And it was to Britain, and later to the United States, that they looked for this support. So this paper will examine very briefly books in English covering the period since 1948, looking at how this narrative, this Zionist Israeli narrative, attained its preeminent status. It's worth noting that in some quarters in America in particular, to even suggest that this narrative is hegemonic is considered offensive, while at the same time, any attempt to challenge this narrative provokes strong reactions. So does any suggestion that the Zionist movement in Israel were not always and invariably underdogs or victims. Paradoxically, this sense of victimization is a cornerstone of the Zionist narrative. Instead of the history of the modern Jewish presence in Palestine being told as the litany of successes and triumphs that it is, this history is rather treated as an appendage to the narrative of genuine Jewish victimhood over the 2 millennia of European history, culminating in the Holocaust. In other words, it's a history of tragedy and victimization, and what has happened in Palestine since, over the past century and more, is treated as an appendage to that. Now, while this narrative of victimization was just as triumphant in the Anglo-American world of letters and scholarship as Zionism and Israel were in Palestine, this paper touches on some of the challenges to this narrative, in particular in the last few decades, and how it's been possible to pose a challenge to it. In the immediate wake of the 1948 war, and in the decades down to the 67 war, the general tenor of most writing in English on Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict was driven by Zionist and Israeli concerns and attitudes. Specifically, much attention was lavished on the supposedly miraculous nature of the establishment of Israel in the face of Arab opposition and in the face of what was described as the indifference or hostility of much of the rest of the world to the Zionist project, with a narrow focus on the supposed opposition of the British. Naturally, this involved concentration on the years after the 1939 White Paper, when the British did try to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine because they needed to win Arab support in view of the looming World War. This approach studiously ignored the 2 preceding decades, during which unstinting British support was crucial to the entrenchment in Palestine of a yeshuv, of a Jewish community, which grew from under 10% of the population in 1917 to over 31% in 1939, and which had come to dominate Palestine's economy by 1939. This narrow focus mirrored the Israeli narrative, which is of an anti-colonial struggle for self-determination against the anti-Semitic British. It may be difficult for this audience to believe it, but that's what most Israelis actually think. It was only recently, with the publication of Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, that it was possible for English-speaking readers to find a comprehensive work that shattered that myth. In most of the literature produced before 1967, the Arabs were portrayed extremely negatively, with dark hints that they were driven by anti-Semitism and indeed were Nazi sympathizers. The Palestinians, if they were mentioned at all, and they generally were not mentioned, were described as having left their homes at their leader's behest, the better to enable the Arab armies to wipe out the fledgling Jewish state. I say this with as much sarcasm as I can because you know that this is not true, this is what is believed. By contrast, the general picture of Israelis in this literature was highly positive. It featured photos of handsome young men and buxom young women in shorts, busy making the desert bloom. That was Israel. The Palestinians didn't exist. In this period, there was also much scholarship addressing the achievements of the new Israeli state in integrating immigrants, building a strong economy, fashioning state institutions, and so forth. Little attention was paid in these works to the crucial role of foreign capital in this process, to the continued support that Israel received from the great powers, or to what happened to the Palestinians who had been forced to flee, or those left behind in Israel living under military rule. In my view, the iconic work of the period to 1967 was not a scholarly one. It was rather a thoroughly mediocre, but nevertheless highly influential novel. This was entitled Exodus. And according to the obituary of its author, Leon Uris, it equaled the sales of Gone with the Wind, which was the best-selling book in American history before that. Together with the Academy Award-winning 1960 movie of the same name, starring, of course, Paul Newman, this book probably did more to disseminate these and other myths than all the English language scholarly publications to this point combined. Exodus, incidentally, was commissioned by a professional public relations expert and a committed Zionist, a man by the name of Edward Gottlieb, who is desirous of improving Israel's image and who chose Uris to send the novel and gave him money and sent him to Israel. Given that many of the basic ideas, I think most of the basic ideas about Palestine and Israel held by an entire generation of Americans who came to maturity during the 60s and 70s find their origin either in the book or the movie, it can be argued that Gottlieb's inspiration to send Leon Uris to Israel may have constituted one of the greatest advertising triumphs of the 20th century. Needless to say, the account purveyed in the bulk of the mainstream academic literature and in popular works like Exodus was totally at odds with reality. A very few Palestinian and Western scholars, one of them, of course, Walid al-Khaldi, pointed this out in the late 50s and early 60s. Among the main points in dispute was Israel's responsibility for the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, the majority of the country's population, and the true nature of the 1948 war. A huge edifice of pseudo-scholarship and propaganda was devoted to obscuring the realities of the dispossession of the Palestinians, as well as to showing that the Arabs, who were supposedly much stronger than the Jews in Palestine, had both the intention and the capability to strangle the infant Israeli state at birth, a fate averted only by heroic sacrifice and miraculous good luck. The results of those who challenged this fairy tale in the 50s and 60s were studiously ignored. Instead, most mainstream writing in English repeated these unfounded assertions, which precisely mirrored the founding myths of Israel. It was not until nearly 4 decades after 1948, in the late 80s, that the writings of people like Walid al-Khaldi, Erskine Childers, and a very few others were substantiated by research based on newly released documents from the Israeli state archives. These were published in a series of books by the so-called new Israeli historians, people like Tom Segev, Simcha Flapan, Benny Morris, Avi Shleim, and Ilan Pape, all of whose names I'm sure you know, and many of whose books have in fact been published in Arabic by the Institute. In the interim, and before '67, much had been done to cement this traditional Israeli narrative in the American and British public mind. In the '60s, however, there were important changes going on in the American Jewish community and in American attitudes towards Israel. As the American historian, the great American historian, a former colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, Peter Novick, has shown in his masterful work, The Holocaust in American Life. That's actually a book we should translate into Arabic. Several factors increased the attachment to Israel of the American Jewish community. One of them was the heightened prominence of the Holocaust as a central feature in American Jewish identity. I grew up in New York. Nobody talked about the Holocaust. The families of Holocaust survivors did not talk about the Holocaust. The word was not used. They knew it had happened, but it was never mentioned in the 50s or into the 60s. So there was a heightened prominence of the Holocaust in American Jewish identity from the 60s onwards. And there were other changes in American Jewish identity as a result of the '67 war, which had a galvanizing effect on American Jewish attachment to Israel. In part, This was a function of a new myth. The myth that on the eve of the June War, Israel faced the possibility of another Holocaust, a myth which has come to have almost the status of gospel in certain quarters in the United States. This has become entrenched in American opinion, although all serious scholarship has always shown that notwithstanding the fears of the Israeli public, both the Israeli and American intelligence and military communities were unanimous in their assessment that Israel would crush the Arab armies whether or not Israel attacked first, and that therefore in June 1967 Israel was never in serious danger of defeat, let alone extermination. In spite of this, the myth is widespread. The growing emphasis on the Holocaust and the increased identification with Israel grew into what have now been institutionalized into two central pillars of American Jewish identity. This was not the case before the 60s, by the way. This is a new development since the 1960s. American Jewish identity thus became much more focused on Israel than before. These changes in the views of American Jews, or at least most American Jews, were mirrored by an important transformation in how American public opinion came to view Israel. This was partly influenced by the impact of what was described as another miraculous Israeli victory in 1967. But the prevalence, and the prevalence of this narrative was the result of much effort devoted by Friends of Israel to establishing this version of reality in scholarship, in journalism, and elsewhere. But another factor played a major role with American public opinion. And this was the fact that the US government increasingly came to see Israel as an ally in its Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. This was not always the case. The United States and the Soviet Union both supported the founding of Israel in 1947-48. They both opposed the Anglo-French attack on Egypt in 1956. But by 1967, the United States had become completely aligned with Israel against the Arab states, many of which were supported by the Soviet Union, in a configuration that continued until the end of the Cold War, until 1989, 90, 91. Now, there are many points which may be chosen as tipping points, marking the Cold War alignment of Israel with the United States. One could talk about President Kennedy's delivery of the first ever US military equipment to Israel in the early 60s, or one could talk about President Johnson's increasing alienation from Egypt and from Gamal Abdel Nasser in 64 and 65, and Johnson's deep sympathy for Israel. His sympathy was derived in part from his close, even intimate friendships with many pro-Israel donors to the Democratic Party, and other factors I can talk about during the questions if you're interested. The searing impact of the Vietnam War, I'm told I have 5 minutes, but I'm going to just go on as long as I can. The searing impact of the Vietnam War on US policymakers was also a factor in causing them to see the world, including the Middle East, in starker Cold War terms than had been the case previously. In looking at English language literature on the Arab-Israeli conflict after '67, it's clear that the June War played a crucial role in this closer alignment with Israel. I won't talk about the details here. I'll skip a paragraph, so I'm concession to the chair. After 1967, much of the academic writing in the fields of political science, international relations, and policy studies, and with it most of American public opinion, followed the lead of the policymakers. In general, there was a further demonization of the Arab states, a further demonization of the Palestinians, which emphasized their alignment with the Soviets and their terrorist proclivities. These tropes persisted, in fact, until the end of the Cold War. Now, in the decades since 1967, there have been positive changes in the way the Palestine question was treated in the English language literature. These started first with these changes started first with books published in Great Britain, and it was British academic publishers who first issued the works of the Israeli new historians and other scholars who were the first to challenge the received Israeli-influenced version of the history of the conflict. But this eventually spread to the United States. And the fields where this new approach was most visible were comparative literature, history, and anthropology, and a few others. Events in the Middle East also played a part in the evolution of thinking in the United States. The growth of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement had a positive impact, and the human face of the Palestinians, which had previously been totally obscured, could be discerned for the first time in writings that appeared in the 1970s and 80s. The Israeli siege and bombardment of Beirut, and the subsequent massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which were heavily covered in the US media, played a role in changing the US view of who is David and who is Goliath in the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. The first Palestinian Intifada reinforced this new sense in American public opinion of the Palestinians rather than the Israelis as underdogs. And as Bishara said, as my view, it was the major Palestinian victory of the whole last century. Some people could say, I would say, the only major Palestinian victory. Finally, the Madrid-Oslo peace process furthered this process of seeing the Palestinians as human. Much of this progress was undone by the Second Intifada, especially by Palestinian suicide bombings, which shocked Americans who were deeply affected by the attacks of 9/11 and reestablished a negative perception of Palestinians. Nevertheless, the space had been opened up for both academic and trade publishers to consider publishing more nuanced and balanced treatments of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The very term Palestine, once considered taboo by mainstream publishers, and you heard the way in which this was the case in France, it was even more the case in the United States, was now more acceptable than had been the case previously. The result was the publication of a large number of works that enabled English-speaking readers for the first time to have access to a range, a variety of